Talk Ava. Learn English with confidence.
Something happened to me recently that kept bothering me longer than it should have. I was sitting with a friend and I needed a pen for a minute, so I looked at him and said, "Can you borrow me your pen?" He understood me immediately and gave me the pen, but after I said it, the sentence stayed in my head because it sounded strange somehow.
That kind of moment is actually very useful for language learning because your instinct notices the problem before your brain fully explains it. A lot of learners ignore those moments since communication still works, but those small, uncomfortable reactions usually point directly to unnatural English.
That explains why I kept thinking about it afterward. The meaning was completely clear, so part of me thought the sentence should be fine, but another part felt like the words were moving in the wrong direction.
That's a good way to describe it because direction is the real issue here. By the way, welcome to Talk Ava. If you enjoy learning English through natural conversations instead of memorizing isolated rules, you can subscribe and continue learning with us every week.
What confuses me about borrow and lend is that they both describe almost the same situation. There's still one object, still two people, and still temporary use. So my brain keeps treating them like interchangeable words.
Most learners do that at first because the event itself feels shared, but English pays close attention to perspective inside the event. Listen to these two sentences carefully. Can you borrow me your pen? And can you lend me your pen? One sounds natural immediately, while the other feels slightly uncomfortable.
The second sentence definitely sounds smoother to me. The first one is understandable, but something inside it feels reversed once I compare them side by side.
That's because the movement inside the sentence changes. The meaning is clear, but the direction is wrong. Native speakers often notice that direction instinctively, even if they never studied the grammar rule formally.
I think the word movement helps me more than grammar explanations because I can actually imagine the pen traveling from one person to another. Suddenly, the mistake feels logical instead of random.
That's the key difference developing in your thinking. Borrow usually focuses on receiving something temporarily, while lend focuses on giving something temporarily. The event stays the same, but the viewpoint changes depending on who becomes the center of the sentence.
So when I said, "Can you borrow me your pen?" I accidentally described the action from the wrong side, even though the overall situation still made sense.
Yes, and that's why the sentence sounds understandable but unnatural. Let's test the feeling a little more. If someone says, "I borrowed a jacket from my cousin," the sentence feels natural because the jacket moves toward the speaker. But if someone says, "My cousin lent me a jacket," the same event is described from the opposite direction.
That's interesting because the event itself doesn't change at all, only the perspective changes. One sentence focuses on the receiver and the other focuses on the giver.
And English cares about that difference much more than learners expect. Many learners memorize the dictionary meaning but don't notice the direction emotionally while speaking quickly.
I think translation also creates part of the problem because some languages don't separate the movement this clearly. Then English suddenly forces you to think about who gives and who receives every single time.
That happens very often. During fast conversation, people focus on the object or the event itself instead of the direction inside the action. That's why even advanced learners sometimes produce sentences that are understandable but still sound slightly unnatural.
So borrow and lend are basically connected to the same moment, but they look at that moment from opposite sides.
Yes, and once you notice that, the confusion becomes easier to control. Let's go a little deeper, because this is where many learners start doubting themselves. You asked earlier if borrow and lend are basically the same word, and the answer is only partly true.
I still feel that confusion, honestly, because the situations overlap so much that my brain keeps trying to simplify them into one idea.
The situations overlap, but the movement changes everything. Think about these examples carefully. I borrowed money from my brother. Then compare it with my brother lent me money. Same money, same people, same event, but the direction changes completely.
Now I can feel the difference more clearly, because one sentence pulls the action toward me while the other pushes the action away from the other person.
That's a strong observation. Once movement becomes visible in your mind, the words stop feeling random. Let me ask you another question that confuses a lot of learners. Which sentence sounds more natural to you? Can you lend me $20 or can you borrow me $20?
The first sentence sounds much more natural now because the money is moving from the other person toward me. The second sentence still feels understandable, but the direction suddenly feels broken once I think about it carefully.
That reaction is important because it shows your instinct is improving. Borrow usually moves toward the speaker, while lend usually moves away from the speaker. Native speakers feel that movement immediately without consciously translating it.
I think this explains why some mistakes sound strange even when the meaning is obvious. Communication alone isn't enough because English also wants the direction to feel natural.
That's true, and that's why learners sometimes feel frustrated. They know people understand them, but they still feel disconnected from natural English. The missing piece is often perspective, not vocabulary.
So instead of memorizing borrow and lend as simple meanings, I should focus on where the action starts and where it travels.
That's the right approach, because once you understand the movement clearly, the sentence structure starts feeling much more natural during real conversation.
I can already feel the difference more clearly than before, but something still confuses me. When you say the event stays the same while the perspective changes, my brain understands the idea for a moment, then suddenly starts mixing everything together again when I imagine real conversations.
That's normal, because your brain is trying to hold two things at the same time. The situation itself remains identical, but the viewpoint inside the sentence changes depending on who becomes the focus. Let's slow it down and look at one event from both directions carefully.
That usually helps because when I hear isolated rules, they disappear from my head quickly. Real situations stay longer.
Good. Imagine this situation. Sarah has a book, and you need it for a few days. You ask her, she gives it to you, and later you return it. Now listen to these two sentences. I borrowed a book from Sarah. Then Sarah lent me a book.
Both sentences sound natural to me, and they both describe the same exact event. That part feels strange because the action itself doesn't change at all.
The action stays the same, but the camera angle changes. In the first sentence, you become the center because the book moves toward you. In the second sentence, Sarah becomes the center because the book moves away from her.
That camera angle idea actually makes the difference easier to feel. One sentence follows the receiver and the other follows the giver.
Yes, and that's why native speakers usually don't confuse these words. They instinctively follow the movement inside the event. Learners often focus only on the object itself, which is why the two words start blending together.
I think that's exactly what happens to me while speaking quickly. I see the situation in my head, but I don't always stop to think about where the movement begins.
And during real conversation, your brain doesn't have much time to analyze grammar rules consciously. That's why instinct matters more than memorization here. Let's test your instinct with another example. Which sentence feels more natural? I borrowed some money from Alex, or Alex borrowed me some money.
The first sentence sounds natural immediately. The second one feels understandable, but something inside it feels broken again.
That reaction matters because many learners produce the second sentence without realizing why it sounds strange. The listener still understands the meaning, but the direction becomes unnatural.
So when I hear Alex borrowed me some money, my brain feels confused because borrow is suddenly moving away from Alex instead of toward the speaker.
That's the issue. Borrow naturally pulls the object toward the person receiving it. Lend naturally pushes the object away from the person giving it. Once you reverse that movement, the sentence starts sounding unnatural even when communication still works.
This is interesting because earlier I thought the problem was vocabulary. Now it feels more like visual movement inside the sentence.
That's a much stronger way to understand it. Vocabulary memorization alone usually fails with confusing word pairs like this, because the real difference lives inside perspective and direction.
I'm noticing something else too. When I hear the correct sentence, my brain relaxes immediately. When I hear the wrong version, I understand it, but my brain keeps resisting it slightly.
That resistance is your instinct developing. Natural English usually creates a smooth mental picture. Unnatural English creates a small interruption, even when the meaning remains clear.
That explains why some mistakes are hard to notice alone. If people understand you, it's easy to assume the sentence is completely fine.
That happens constantly with learners, especially with mistakes connected to movement and perspective. This is where learners usually break the pattern because they start trusting meaning alone instead of natural direction.
I feel like this next part is probably where the dangerous mistakes appear.
It is, because now we move into sentences that sound understandable, but still feel unnatural to native speakers. Listen carefully to these three examples. Can I borrow your phone? Can you borrow me your phone? And can you lend me your phone?
The first and third sentences sound natural to me. The middle one sounds strange again, even though I completely understand the meaning.
That middle sentence creates confusion because the movement doesn't match the word naturally. Many learners think the sentence should work because the overall situation is clear, but native speakers hear the direction immediately.
So even though the phone still moves from one person to another in all three examples, the wording changes whether the movement feels natural or not.
Yes, and this is why simple translation becomes dangerous. Learners often memorize borrow and lend as connected meanings without noticing who the movement moves toward. Let's test this more carefully. If I say, "Can I borrow your phone?" who becomes the receiver?
I do, because the phone moves toward me temporarily.
Good. Now, if I say, "Can you lend me your phone?" what changes?
The phone still comes toward me, but now the sentence focuses on the person giving instead of the person receiving.
That's the perspective shift again. Same event, different viewpoint. Now look at the unnatural sentence. Can you borrow me your phone? Why does it feel uncomfortable?
Because borrow suddenly points in the wrong direction. The movement stops matching the natural perspective of the word.
That's the key idea learners often miss. You know the words, but not who they move toward.
That line makes the confusion much clearer because the problem is not meaning anymore, it's direction control. Once the movement breaks, the sentence starts sounding unnatural immediately.
And this becomes even more important in fast conversation because native speakers don't consciously analyze grammar while listening. They react instinctively to whether the movement feels natural or unnatural.
I think this also explains why some mistakes survive for years. Learners keep getting understood, so they never realize the direction still sounds strange.
That's true, and it's why developing instinct matters so much. Natural English follows movement direction very consistently, even when learners don't notice it consciously at first.
So instead of memorizing borrow and lend separately, I should mentally follow where the object travels inside the sentence.
That's the strongest approach because once your brain sees the movement clearly, the sentences start feeling natural automatically instead of feeling like memorized grammar rules.
I just realized something dangerous about this topic. Earlier, I thought the confusion only came from borrow and lend themselves, but now it feels like small words around them can completely change the sentence too. Sometimes one tiny change suddenly makes the whole direction feel wrong.
That's true, and this is usually the point where learners become either much more accurate or much more confused. Listen carefully to this sentence. I borrowed him some money.
That sounds wrong immediately. I understand the idea, but the sentence feels broken somehow.
Now compare it with these two sentences. I borrowed some money from him, then I lent him some money. Both sound natural because the direction matches the structure correctly.
I can feel the difference very clearly now. In the first natural sentence, the money moves toward me from him. In the second one, the money moves away from me toward him.
Yes, and the sentence that sounds wrong mixes those directions together in an unnatural way.
This is where prepositions become extremely important because they quietly control the movement inside the sentence.
That's interesting because learners usually focus on the main verbs and ignore smaller words like from or to. But now it feels like those small words are controlling everything.
In many cases, they are. One small preposition can reverse the whole meaning. That's why borrow from feels natural, while lend to feels natural. The preposition supports the direction already built into the verb.
So when someone says, I borrowed him some money, the listener understands the situation, but the structure creates a conflict because borrow naturally expects movement toward the speaker, not toward another person.
That's the issue. Native speakers usually react to that conflict instinctively, even if they never stop to explain the grammar consciously. Let's test your instinct with another pair. Which sentence sounds more natural? She lent money to me, or she borrowed money to me?
The first one sounds natural immediately. The second one feels strange because borrow suddenly starts moving in the wrong direction again.
Good. Now, notice something important. Earlier, you were mostly memorizing meanings. Now your brain is starting to notice movement problems automatically while listening.
I can actually feel that happening. Before this conversation, I probably would have focused only on whether the meaning was understandable. Now I notice whether the direction feels smooth too.
That shift matters because natural English depends heavily on relationships between verbs and structure. Learners often think vocabulary alone creates fluency, but real fluency usually comes from understanding how words behave together naturally.
I think this also explains why some mistakes survive for years. If people still understand you, it's easy to believe the sentence is fully correct.
That happens constantly, especially with mistakes connected to direction and movement. Let's move into some real-life situations, because this is where the patterns become easier to remember naturally instead of mechanically.
Real situations help a lot because isolated examples sometimes disappear from my head after a few minutes.
Imagine you're in a classroom and your pen stops working during an exam. You turn to another student and say, "Can I borrow your pen for a minute?" That sounds natural because the pen temporarily moves toward you.
Yes, that sentence feels completely comfortable now.
Now, imagine someone says, "Can you borrow me your pen?" The meaning is understandable, but the direction starts feeling unnatural again.
What's interesting is that the mistake feels much more obvious to me now than it did at the beginning of the conversation. Earlier, I mostly noticed the sentence sounded strange. Now I can actually see why it sounds strange.
That's because your instinct is connecting movement to the structure automatically. Let's try another situation. Imagine your friend needs money for lunch and asks, "Can you lend me $10 until tomorrow?"
That sounds natural because the money moves away from the speaker toward the friend.
Good. Now compare it with, "Can you borrow me $10 until tomorrow?"
That sounds wrong much faster now. The direction breaks immediately once I hear it.
That's the instinct developing again. Let's make the situation slightly more difficult. Suppose your cousin says, "I borrowed $50 from Alex yesterday." Then later, Alex says, "I lent your cousin $50 yesterday." What changes between those two sentences?
The event stays identical, but the focus shifts depending on who tells the story. One sentence follows the receiver, and the other follows the giver.
That perspective shift is the heart of the entire topic. Now let's move to another real-life situation, because clothing creates confusion too. Imagine you're cold and ask your friend for a jacket. Which sentence sounds natural? Can I borrow your jacket? Or can I lend you your jacket?
Can I borrow your jacket? Sounds natural because I'm receiving the jacket temporarily.
Good. Now imagine your friend describes the same moment later. Which sentence sounds natural? I lent Dave my jacket, or I borrowed Dave my jacket?
The first sentence sounds natural immediately. The second one feels broken because the direction reverses again.
And that repetition matters because your brain learns patterns through repeated natural movement. Let me ask you one more question that learners often hesitate on. Which sentence sounds more natural? I borrowed a charger from my friend, or my friend borrowed me a charger?
The first sentence sounds much smoother because the charger moves toward me from my friend. The second sentence feels understandable, but the structure still sounds unnatural.
That reaction shows your instinct is becoming more stable now. Instead of translating the event generally, you're following the movement inside the sentence automatically.
I think that's the biggest change for me. Earlier, I was trying to memorize two confusing verbs. Now it feels like I'm tracking direction naturally while listening and speaking.
That's why real-life usage patterns matter so much. Once movement becomes clear in your mind, borrow and lend stop feeling random and start feeling logical during actual conversation.
I think the biggest change for me is that borrow and lend no longer feel like random vocabulary words. Earlier, I was trying to memorize them separately, and every new sentence created another confusion. Now the whole topic feels more connected because I can actually follow the movement inside the sentence.
That's the mental shift we were aiming for from the beginning. Most learners think they're choosing between two similar words, but that's not really what's happening. You're not choosing a word, you're choosing direction.
That idea changed everything for me, because direction feels much easier to track than grammar rules. The moment I imagine the object moving, the sentence suddenly becomes clearer.
That's because borrow and lend are built around movement. Borrow usually describes movement toward you, while lend describes movement away from you. The object itself matters less than the direction it travels inside the situation.
I can feel that much more clearly now. If I say, I borrowed a book from Emma, the book moves toward me temporarily. If I say, Emma lent me a book, the same event stays intact, but now the focus follows the person giving it away temporarily.
Yes, and native speakers usually feel that movement instinctively without stopping to analyze the sentence consciously. That's why some mistakes sound strange immediately, even when the meaning remains understandable.
I think that explains why I kept producing unnatural sentences before. I understood the event perfectly, but I wasn't tracking the movement carefully enough while speaking.
That happens to many learners because they focus heavily on ownership instead of direction. But borrow and lend are not really about permanent ownership at all. It's not ownership, it's movement.
That line makes the entire topic feel simpler, because ownership confused me sometimes. I kept thinking about who had the object instead of thinking about where the object was traveling.
And once your brain follows the movement naturally, the sentence usually becomes easier to build correctly. Let's test your instinct one more time with a few situations. Imagine your friend asks for your charger, and you say, I can lend you my charger for tonight. Why does that feel natural?
Because the charger moves away from me toward the other person temporarily. The direction matches lend naturally.
Good. Now imagine the opposite perspective. You need the charger, so you say, can I borrow your charger tonight? Why does that feel natural?
Because now the charger moves toward me instead. The event is almost identical, but the viewpoint changes completely depending on who becomes the center of the sentence.
That's the core insight. The situation itself often stays the same, but the direction changes the structure naturally. Once you understand that deeply, you stop translating word for word and start feeling the sentence more naturally.
I think this conversation changed how I listened to English too. Earlier, I mostly paid attention to vocabulary meaning. Now, I notice relationships between words much more carefully.
That's an important stage because fluency usually grows through patterns, not isolated meanings. Native speakers often feel these patterns automatically after years of exposure, while learners need to notice them consciously first.
I still feel a small hesitation before speaking sometimes, but now the hesitation feels productive instead of confusing. Earlier, I was guessing. Now, I'm checking movement mentally before choosing the word.
That's a healthy transition because confidence doesn't come from speaking without thinking. Real confidence usually comes from understanding why something sounds natural.
Let me try a few examples naturally now, because I want to see if the direction feels automatic. If I say, can I borrow your notebook for tonight? That sounds comfortable to me now because the notebook moves toward me temporarily.
Yes, and the sentence sounds natural because the movement matches the perspective correctly.
Then, if the other person talks about the same situation later, they would probably say, I lent Dave my notebook for one night. Earlier, that perspective shift would have confused me much more.
Now it sounds more stable because your brain sees the event from both sides instead of trying to memorize disconnected rules. Let's try another one. Suppose your friend says, "Can you lend me some cash until tomorrow?" How does that feel now?
That feels natural immediately because the money moves away from the speaker toward the friend. But if someone said, can you borrow me some cash until tomorrow, the sentence would feel unnatural much faster now.
That quick reaction shows your instinct is improving. You're no longer relying only on meaning, you're checking whether the direction feels smooth too.
I honestly didn't expect such a small word pair to create this much difference in perspective. At the beginning, borrow and lend felt almost interchangeable to me.
That's what makes English interesting sometimes. Tiny changes can completely reshape the natural feeling of a sentence, even when the overall meaning stays understandable.
I think the most useful part for me was learning to visualize movement. That made the topic feel much more logical and much less random.
And that approach works for many confusing English word pairs, especially when direction or perspective controls the sentence naturally. If you start noticing those hidden patterns, your English becomes much more fluent over time.
I'm already curious about other word pairs now, because I feel like this happens in English more often than learners realize.
It happens constantly, and that's why these conversations matter. English has many word pairs like this. Small change, completely different direction. If you enjoyed learning this way, you can subscribe and continue exploring more natural English conversations with us in future episodes.